Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy and this is the Locked Up Living podcast where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. Today we're meeting with Robert Verkaik. Robert is an author and journalist specialising in security and social mobility. His journalism appears in The Guardian, Independent, newspaper, Sunday Telegraph and Sunday Times. Robert was the Home Affairs editor and law editor at The Independent, where he worked for 12 years. After leaving The Independent, he worked at the Mail on Sunday as security editor. Since the 9/11 attacks on America, he has covered the war on terror and has visited the US detention camp at Guantanamo Bay and interviewed victims of torture in Syria. He's also headed media campaigns against secret justice and in support of greater press freedoms. More recently, he's been writing about the causes of extremism and social immobility. In his writing, he's been longlisted for both the Orwell Prize and the Paul Foot Awards. He was a runner-up in the Specialist Journalist category at the 2013 National Press Awards. He's also a non-practicing qualified barrister called to the bar in 2007. Robert is the author of 6 books. The Traitor of Arnhem, which was published in 2024, is the latest of those, and we will list the others in the show notes. Welcome, Robert.
Nice to meet you both.
Hi, Robert. Really good to have you on today and to join us. Robert, several of your books have a strong theme of social inequality running through them. Why are you so passionate about this subject?
I think that probably goes back to my time at a school, really. I went to a secondary modern school, and in that school, there were lots of different people from different social economic strata, and it was a boys' school, and when I first started, 11 years old, there were boys in that class who were much brighter than I was, but as the years went on, they fell by the wayside, and they never really achieved their potential. And in fact, one of the sort of things that I remember most is just after school, when I was heading to university, I met one of them on a London bus. He was a bus conductor, and the guy had, I remember him very well because he was clearly the brightest boy in the class. From 12 to about 13, he was top of the class in everything. And then here he was working as a bus conductor in London. Probably doing reasonably well. But I did think that he never had a chance to go to university. He never had a chance to change his life circumstances, and he was typical of a lot of boys who simply never had a chance to do anything to affect their life chances. And so that was a sort of searing indictment as far as I was concerned, in terms of the way that our system divides us into winners and losers from birth. And then I guess through my journalism at The Independent, I did a lot of social mobility writing. And then when I left journalism and started working as a cab volunteer, it kind of became very acute as to what the problems was. I was seeing poverty at the very close quarters, and I was seeing the kind of people that I'd been going to school with, and I was seeing how they'd ended up in the situations that they were in, and how they weren't ever going to get out of the situations that they were in, and how they were now kind of dependent on benefits and the victims of social injustice. So I think because it was CAB, when I was doing Citizens Advice, it was during the pandemic, that brought home some terrible examples of social injustice. And I guess that's what sort of drove me to write that book, Why You Won't Get Rich.
As you were talking, I was thinking about how much poverty and inequality we've seen on the news. I mean, it's kind of been driven off the headlines of the news, partly because of war in Ukraine and Gaza, but also I wonder to what degree people have become a little bit desensitized. But it seemed for a very long time as if we were seeing food banks appearing repeatedly on the news in a way that is quite shocking when you compare what life was like sort of in previous decades. But the book that made me get in contact with you, as I read recently Why You Won't Get Rich, within which you focus very heavily on financial inequality, and you do draw the distinction between being rich and being wealthy, and I think it'd be great if you could explain that. But also it did make me wonder whether it's possible for someone to become not even wealthy but just rich while still being considered ethical.
Yeah, I think there is a difference between being rich and being wealthy, and I think the main difference is that if you're rich, you are relying on an income to keep you rich, and the point about that is that you could lose that income, that stream of money that makes you rich. So whatever it is, whether you're in business or whether you've got a very high paid job and a big salary, then that's a temporary thing, because you could lose it at any time. I mean, you may not lose it, and you might go on to use your income to create real wealth. But if you're wealthy, you don't really need an income, because you have your wealth is dependent on your assets, and these are sort of fixed. They generate income and wealth, regardless of what you do. It's not a temporary situation. It's a permanent, fixed state of wealth. So that's the difference. So lots of people are rich in this country, but very few are genuinely wealthy. And kind of,
I guess they're the people Jeremy Hunt had sympathy for when he was talking about 100,000 not being that much to live on.
That's right. Yes, he talked about. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think he's directing his comments towards the middle classes rather than the very wealthy or the very rich. Even he's talking about people in the middle classes who traditionally been the kind of the engine of capitalism, and it's what Theresa May described as the jams are just about managing. These are people who are now finding that even though they're earning £100,000 a year, maybe a family is earning £100,000 a year, and they're still finding it hard to manage because mortgages have rocketed. They might be sending their children to private schools. They might be expecting to go on holiday once or twice a year. £100,000 may not cut it for these people who are probably working very hard, and they might even have two breadwinners in the family. But these days, £100,000, although I accept that a lot of people will think £100,000, you can cope on £100,000. It shouldn't be a problem. But I think there are families or people who come to expect a standard of living that is not going to be guaranteed if you're on £100,000. I think that's what Jeremy Hunt is talking about, and these are clearly key Tory voters who are finding it hard to get by, even on that salary or even on that level of income. The very wealthy, I don't think he needs to worry about too much.
But I interrupted you rudely before letting you answer about whether it's possible to be ethical and wealthy at the same time, which I think is important.
I I think you can be wealthy and ethical. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence to show that people want to be ethical with their wealth. There's a group of people called, I think they're called the patriotic billionaires in America, and they wrote to the government saying, we don't believe that the taxation system in America is fair because we are not paying our fair share of tax. And many of them are philanthropists, so they're giving money away anyway, to try and sort of counter their wealth and good fortune. But what they're saying is, we want the state to do that. We don't want, you shouldn't rely on wealthy people to be philanthropists to compensate for an unfair tax system. So they want the government to step in and make the system fairer so that they pay more tax, which is strange, but has also been was also reflected during the pandemic. Actually, there was a group of chief executives from top FTSE companies who wrote to the Prime Minister asking similarly to be, to create a much fairer tax system which supported a much wider section of the community and didn't favour them in the way that it does. So I think you can be ethical and wealthy, and I think lots of wealthy people want to be ethical, but because of the system, they have to be philanthropic rather than simply comply with the taxation system in this country. In fact, there was a good story that I picked up. I don't know if you read it in the book. It was about a coal mining community in County Durham, and people wandering around the streets, and they would find wads of £50 notes in all sorts of odd places, like in the community town hall or sometimes in the pub, and they were in envelopes, and they'd pick them up, and it turned out that someone who was born in that community had become very wealthy, but they found the burden of their wealth so great that they had to go around the village at night or whenever, delivering wads of notes to less fortunate people than themselves. And I just think that tells you how unfair the system, or how much need there is for reform of a system when people are doing those kind of things.
But also a really nice uplifting story when you contrast that with some of the stories that we've seen over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, really, where people have really exploited whatever system they can to amplify their wealth. So I thought it was a really nice story in your book. Actually, it's like a real life Father Christmas in that community.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things you touch on in your book, Robert, is the impact of working people being unable to afford to live in the communities they serve. So that might be nurses, police, prison officers. Why should this be of concern to all of us?
Yeah, I noticed this when I was working with Citizens Advice, that some of the people I was meeting were people you wouldn't expect to see looking for. Well, we could authorise food bank vouchers, and police officers, nurses were coming in and asking for that kind of assistance. And it's not, you don't just sign off the certificate. You talk to them or try and find out about what's going on in their lives that makes it so difficult for them when they're working and they're not receiving enough money to make ends meet. And I discovered that some of these people, some of these nurses, firemen, police officers, found that they were living outside of their communities. They couldn't afford to live, because of rents mostly, couldn't afford to live in the communities they serve. So sometimes some of the firemen were living hundreds of miles away. They were literally commuting into the communities where they were born, and where they still had friends and families, but they just could not afford the rents. And this was actually let me tell you a bit of context. It was Surrey, so you can see why there are extraordinarily wealthy parts of Surrey where this was happening. But the reason, so your question was about why should that be of any consequence? Why should we want our first responders to be in the community? It's because these people are crucial to a thriving community. They are the people we rely on when we're in our most dire need. And if they don't have contact or a stake in society, then it makes it more difficult for them to do their jobs. It sort of undermines their contribution. If they're not living and paying rent in the community and sending their children to the same schools as everybody else, then they have less interest, or they let less understanding of how the community works, and they can't do their jobs as effectively. And so that should concern all of us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you consider sort of this emphasis, people talk about the need to sort of put a focus on the family, but ultimately the family in a bigger shape is the community, isn't it? And so we all need to have a stake in the places that we're living, to have a sense of cohesion and sense of belonging in the spaces that we're living and serving. And you can see how people would end up being much less invested in their job if they're going into police, a very different area to the area that they're living in themselves, facing different problems. What other ways is the austerity agenda shaping our society?
I think we've had 10 years of austerity, didn't we, under the Tory administration, and then they suddenly said, "Oh, it's all over now. Don't worry. We're no longer interested in austerity." But 10 years of hollowing out social services, benefits payments, not just that. I mean, bus services, all sorts of infrastructure and services that the community relies on to thrive. If you start taking that away through an austerity program, then you are underinvesting in something that requires constant investment. And by doing so, and I think this is a theme that I've kind of returned to a lot in the book, actually, it's just short-term thinking. You're taking money away from vital services to prop up fiscal policies and forgetting what the long-term consequences of that are. And it just comes back to bite you, and it's coming back to bite us now. We've got an NHS service on its knees. There's been no thought for the care sector and how we're going to properly pay for that. It was only now that bus services are suddenly considered vital to communities, because so many people require a bus to get about. We need to subsidise bus services as well. I mean, around where we are, it's now, but they've suddenly come up with the idea of paying £2 for every journey. I think in London it's been like that for a long time, I think, but that's made a big difference, and that's a good investment in a service. It encourages people to get on the buses, for starters, so there's more revenue for the bus services, so it makes them more profitable and thriving. And in the long term, it takes cars off the streets. It just makes sense to rather strip away services and undermine services, to invest in them as much as you can. When things get tough, that's when we should be protecting services and the people who rely upon them, not the other way around.
So I was reading your book, Robert, I was really struck as well by the sense of that awareness of the shame that goes with poverty as well. And actually, even when it makes sense to make sure that services are in place just to make society work better, things run smoothly, us all be able to access services, but alongside the cost, when we don't have those things in place, there is this sense of shame for people that can't afford things or don't have things working in a smooth way, isn't there?
Absolutely. the stigma of poverty is terrible. And just going back to citizens' advice again, we only saw a fraction of the numbers of people in the community who required help, and part of the reason for that was because of the shame of having to turn up for handouts or confronting their poverty in a public way. People would rather sort of suffer in poverty than turn up for handouts, and you can understand why, because it's, especially lots of people have been working for long periods of time, sometimes all their lives, and suddenly, for no fault of their own, they find themselves in the benefit system, and the benefit system can be very humiliating. Things they ask you to do, the forms they ask you to fill in, the questions you're made to answer, and are designed to make life difficult for you, and in many ways humiliate you. It's the wrong approach, I think.
Thank you, Robert. It's fascinating listening to you, actually, and just by the by, really, I was interested to hear where you went to school, and I suspect that the three of us could do an interesting podcast on education alone, because I was brought up on a pretty large council estate where there were 2 secondary modern schools, but I went to a grammar school, which was some miles away in Watford. So, of course, I was then immediately disconnected from all my mates that I'd lived with. So, and then I suspect that, well, I know you moved around quite a lot, Naomi, but you probably went to a comprehensive school, didn't you?
When I went to a secondary, well, I failed my 11 plus. That's why I was at a secondary modern school. So, as you say, that's a whole new podcast, grammar schools.
Yeah, we just need to get someone from a public school on with us.
Yeah, we have it covered.
Yeah. Anyway, look, Robert, in your previous book, Posh Boys, this also deals directly in inequality. And of course, it's quite a topical subject with all the political shenanigans going on. And it's a bit of a controversial area because Labour have suggested they have some plans to remove the particular VAT requirements for private education. Do you think this is a step in the right direction?
I do think it's a step in the right direction, yeah. When I wrote Posh Boys, how the public schools have ruined Britain, how the English public schools ruined Britain, it was 2018, and it was a pretty, it was a pretty controversial and unsympathetic hearing at the time. It was not considered anything that we need to really worry about. It was not top of the political agenda, that's for sure. It was only when Jeremy Corbyn took it up that it became sort of Labour. It's one of the few Labour policies that survived. I think probably maybe the only policy that survived Jeremy Corbyn has been continued under Keir Starmer. So this is VAT imposed on private school fees. So schools that charge fees must add VAT to that, and it's up to them how they pass that on to the parents, whether the fees themselves go up or down. It's up to them how they deal with that. And it's extraordinary how divisive this policy seems to be, because it's attracted a lot of hostility, mostly from the media. Actually, I'm not sure. I think if you look at the polls, you'll see that it's actually quite a popular policy, but not among the media. But I think it's a good one. I think it's a start. I have to say, I would go further. I would remove charitable status altogether, so they don't benefit from all the other state handouts that they do, and they're clearly not servicing communities. They're not part of the community. They're outside our community. They are sort of elite institutions which allow wealthy and rich families to buy an advantage over other children in the community. So that I think they're very divisive, and that from the word go, they separate communities, because families are forced to choose between a private school. Those who can afford it, can choose between a private school and a state school, and you're removing families who would be quite helpful. These are usually families who do have a bit of money and clout and pushy, and if we're all involved in the same school, then they're driving up standards for all the pupils in the school, not just their own children, but it raises all the children's standards. So I just think you need to go a bit further. You need to because I don't think, and this is sort of borne out by Office of Fiscal Studies, that this VAT policy is going to make much difference. I just don't think it will, and nor does the OFT. They don't think it's going to make much difference in terms of moving private school pupils to the state sector. It's not going to affect many families at all, despite what the media claims it will do. So I'd remove charitable status as well, so they don't benefit from other state handouts, and I would also remove the subsidies, the other state subsidies they get, which includes, if you're a diplomat or a member of the armed forces and you want to send your child to a private school, you get a massive discount. That just seems a bit ridiculous to me. We need to get rid of that, because our armed forces and our diplomats are part of the community as much as everybody else. Why do we need to separate them? As soon as they have children. So yeah, I would go a bit further maybe, but I wouldn't necessarily. I don't think you can abolish them overnight. I think that would be quite an impossible task. I don't think you need to. I think you can phase them out and make it make state schools more attractive. So I like the idea of using this. I think it's £1.5 billion revenue you're going to get from the tax, and using it to teachers in state schools. I like that idea.
Yeah, because I live in Oxford, I occasionally have the opportunity to go to see things in various facilities, either in the colleges or the local private schools. I went to one recently where they built a new concert hall. And when I say concert hall, I mean just what I'm saying, the sort of facility you might expect to find in a small city, or a medium-sized city. And it was lovely. And the whole situation was lovely. And, well, of course, one thinks that if every school had this kind of wealth and facility, things would be very different.
Agreed.
Anyway, do you have any other solutions to propose for our current economic situation, Robert?
Well, thank you for asking. I think at the end of the book, Why You Won't Get Rich, I do sort of suggest a program of reform. And, it seems to me that Labour hasn't really done any of this, but Green Party seems to have adopted quite a lot of it. But I think the tax system needs to be reformed quite sort of fundamentally. I think we need to impose a tougher inheritance tax. So I mean, I think it's about £325,000 now that you start paying inheritance tax. But there are so many ways of getting around that. Money is transferred to children long before inheritance tax kicks in. So and it's well known that that's what's been sort of driving one of the factors that's been driving inequality in this country is the transfer of almost untaxed wealth from one generation to the next. And the super rich have been getting super rich, and over the last 10 years or so, I think the number of billionaires has doubled. 1% of the 1% of the country are in this sort of super rich or super wealthy, perhaps you should say, bracket, and they own a quarter of the wealth, most of the income, and most of the land. So we need, if we're serious about dealing with peak inequality, as Danny Dorling calls it, then I think we need to deal with we have to have a fairer inheritance tax as well. But I mean, other things like council tax, that needs, property taxes need to be fairly imposed on communities, because oligarchs or extraordinarily wealthy people living in mansions pay almost the same as someone living in a sort of one-bedroom flat in the same community. I mean, that's insane. There are structural problems that need to be sorted out in terms of the tax system, I think, but that's maybe too ambitious, too progressive for lots of political parties. What about a universal basic income as well? That has been trialed all over the world, and it's been shown to have very positive impacts on communities and societies. And it hasn't created a sort of culture of loafers and liggers and people just exploiting their handouts. I mean, people have used money wisely. If you give people money and respect them to use it wisely, they do. They carry on working, and they feel they've got a greater stake in the community, and they play much bigger roles. And it's also fantastic for everyone's mental health if you are properly staked in society. So universal basic income, I think, might be another way to go.
Is that letting some employers off the hook, though? Just wonder whether, if people are in employment, shouldn't their basic salary cover the ability to live without needing to go to a food bank and without needing other kinds of benefits?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the employers, we still have a national minimum wage. This would work alongside the national minimum wage. So you'd be paid universal basic income, perhaps along the same lines as a universal, as the minimum wage, and employers would still have to pay the minimum wage, but it would mean that we wouldn't be running a benefit system. It would mean that you'd be, I think it's £100 billion a year is the benefits bill in this country, which is by far the greatest tax burden. And if you removed the administration of that, so you'd be giving away a lot of money, but you'd be saving a lot of money in terms of administration alone. And as I say, these trials have found that the benefit to the community has been much greater than people had anticipated. So that's the way I would look at it.
Thank you. I was thinking while you were talking early on, you were talking about the hollowing out of our services, and of course our roads have been hollowed out all over the place, literally. I was thinking, because I watched a short Twitter clip by Hannah Fry, who's that very bright scientific person, and she was describing how Osborne's commentary that he based the austerity agenda on was based upon a particular graph which seemed to show that countries who had a lot of debt, national debt, didn't didn't grow and didn't develop. And she was pointing out that this graph was full of phony data. It had a particularly strong outlier in New Zealand, and 2 other countries weren't included here at all. Isn't it frustrating? There's never really much discussion about these kinds of facts and issues.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. We take, it's kind of, it's fiscal. It's the fiscal truth, isn't it? That if you have too much debt, then you have an economy that's running out of control and isn't delivering value for money for the taxpayer. But as you say, it's because it's said enough times, but it's not actually tested by looking at some of the other ways that other countries have treated debt. Then it doesn't work the same way. And I would say that same with wealth taxes. So it was quite a bit of enthusiasm for a sort of wealth tax, wasn't there? So if you're earning over, I think it was £80,000, then Labour was suggesting, this was under Jeremy Corbyn, that you would have to pay greater income tax. And everyone really sort of, well, not everyone, but there was a recoil. But same with this idea that too much debt is a problem. You have to kill it, and it's the first thing you do. That's not true among other European countries. Wealthy people are taxed at a much higher rate than they are in this country, and I think we need to sort of accept that and not accept these other ideas that haven't been tested or haven't been challenged anyway.
Thank you. So, Robert, you've been a journalist for many years, and you've written for newspapers that span the political spectrum. So what's it like going from a newspaper like The Independent to the Mail on Sunday?
Well, in terms of journalism, because I was security, so I was dealing with, at the time, there was an Islamist terror threat. So it was a specialism that could only be reported one way, really. I think everyone was worried about it, and everyone could see the threat, and it wasn't politicized. So I can write about it in the way that I wrote about The Independent, in the same way I wrote about it at the Mail on Sunday. That wasn't a problem, really. And even we could even talk about victims of the war on terror as well. I wrote obviously at The Independent. I was writing a lot about victims of the war on terror, and to a lesser extent, but I was still able to do it at the Mail on Sunday. I mean, it was the Mail on Sunday who published the first photographs of those inmates in Guantanamo Bay in their orange jumpsuits. So those kind of justice issues were of universal interest to most newspapers. But in terms of culture, it was different, because there was a bit more of a yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir in terms of other work that you're involved in. It was a much more disciplined workplace, and some stories, not in my sector, but some stories that didn't fit the news agenda, or their news agenda, then simply didn't get any coverage. But again, it was a weekly, it was a Sunday newspaper, so there was less room to run these stories. So you wouldn't expect to get as many stories into a Sunday newspaper as you would into daily. If it didn't go on the Monday, it would go on the Tuesday or the Wednesday. If you missed the one Sunday slot, then that's it. That story's spiked. So that's how I would assess the sort of transition from the Independent to the Mail on Sunday.
So you don't think that a journalist's political values necessarily reflect the paper they're employed by?
Well, that's a tough one. I think it's inevitable that you will be attracted to a certain kind of story because of your own political interest. You'll have lots of other perspectives as well, but politics will be one of them. So yeah, I think that's true. I think journalists will follow stories that they like for whatever reasons that they like them for. But there are lots of other stories that you don't require, politics. Like, for instance, I like military history, and I took an interest in spy stories when I was working at both the Independent and the Mail on Sunday, and it doesn't require any politics at all to write about spying, and traitors. That's quite. Most journalists would treat that in exactly the same way.
Thank you. Do you, just touching on the earlier theme, Robert, do those impacted by poverty get a fair deal in the press?
No, I don't think they do. I think lots of the issues that we've been talking about today, simply don't get properly covered in the national newspapers. They're not very exciting. They're not clickbait. You remember newspapers have changed a great deal as well. There isn't much time to develop these kind of stories that are talking about progressive or systemic change. Newspapers are much more, they've gone online for starters, so it's all about clicking through, and they don't have quite so much impact. But stories about poverty and communities that are suffering from poverty and the way we can change all that that's been ignored. It's what has been fascinating is during the election debates, all this has come to the fore, and we are getting, probably getting more interest in these kind of issues than certainly from a sort of fiscal, from a taxation perspective than ever before. But I imagine, once the election's over, then it will be back to business as usual, and little interest in the sort of things we've been talking about today.
You've written books covering quite a range of subjects, as well as being a journalist. How is being an author different to being a journalist?
I've got Catholic tastes, you might say. I don't know why. That's I'm just interested in lots of different things, but I do move from topic to topic. That is true. Well, the biggest difference between being an author and being a journalist is that as an author, you have much more freedom and time. And it was kind of what, in the end, did for me in journalism, because I wasn't getting enough time to pursue the issues and stories that I was interested in. And I didn't want to keep running, I think they call it journalism, where you're just running one story after the other. Whereas as an author, you got time and you can invest in what you're writing. You can play with the ideas, and the cycle is obviously a lot longer, and ultimately it's much more rewarding, I think, and it's more personalized, and you don't have to justify every sentence to an editor.
So, Robert, can you tell us about your latest book and why you thought this was such an important story to tell?
Well, my latest book is about as far away from what we've been talking about today as it's possible to be, but it just kind of tells you that I just like many different subjects and I like to pursue them. So my latest book is called The Traitor of Arnhem, and it's a book about how the one of the key battles of the Second World War, 1944, ended with Stalin entering Berlin for the Allies, and how the Cold War was dictated and determined by that moment and those set of events. But I mean, it has a bit of resonance, because I say that this was the moment which we are living with today. This is why Putin invaded Ukraine. We didn't deal with Stalin in 1944, 1945. Stalin won the war really in 1944, and the sense of betrayal and treachery is still felt by Russia today, and it's a strong part of their political culture. And Putin is really reflecting what Stalin was thinking 80 years ago. So I think it's a story that has it's a spy story as well. So it's it's got a good strong narrative, but it also has something to say about today, politics today, or where we are with Russia.
So you're suggesting really that there's been this lingering feeling in Russia that they were cheated out of something at the end of the Second War?
Well, they were. I guess they weren't. They did most of the cheating, but there was a sense that this was the patriotic war, and there was a sense that more Russians, 20 million Russians died in the Second World War. So they gave the greatest sacrifice, certainly in blood, and that has not been properly reflected in terms of the relationship with the West. And Glasnost and Perestroika was a wonderful sort of opening up of East and West, but many Russians, like Putin, felt betrayed by it, and that with the sense that they're still fighting that great patriotic war, because they feel that lands that they won during the war with Hitler are lands that are rightfully theirs today. And obviously, that's not right, but you have to understand that's the way they feel, and the history informs the way Putin has acted.
So, I mean that well, it's rather I'm not quite sure what words to use here, because you're giving obviously a realistic account of the way that you see it. But to me, it sounds almost as if you're making a sort of comparison with the effects in Germany after the First World War, and the burning sense of resentment in those years.
Yeah, well, again, we didn't really settle that, did we? We kind of the reparations were harsh. The Versailles Treaty was a harsh treaty. We made them pay, and that resentment came back to bite us. So yeah, that's a good. I hadn't thought of that actually. It's an interesting comparison. But with national pride and how people feel about themselves, it's very hard to understand that unless you've been living in Russia, or you've been living in the Weimar Republic. It's hard to see the world in the way that they see it. I mean, they'll have their own prejudices, and they'll have their own sort of warped view of how they see the West. But I think it's important to know what that view is, because you have to take it into account when you're gambling on what Putin's going to do next. Is he so bothered by the way that he feels like he's been swindled out of his Ukrainian frontier, that he's prepared to use a nuclear weapon, or is it just saber rattling? I think that's a really important gamble.
Yes, indeed. Robert, we've covered an awful lot of ground today, more than I expected we would do. And you, in your work, you've covered some quite depressing material in your books. How do you look after yourself?
Oh, yeah, because I mean, some of the Islamist terrorism, because that was so much on social media, and it's hard not to see it without reporting, or hard not to report on it without seeing it. But I mean, me personally, I tend to like to get up in the morning and be educated or find out something new and interesting. That's what keeps me going. It's like, in terms of the way my books are covering different areas of interest, because I'm kind of moving on from subject to subject and not dwelling on some of the things that I have reported on, or I have written. I'm being interested and educated about whatever's next. So I'm now kind of motivated by my next book. And so I think if I was to dwell too much on what's gone on before, then I might become depressed.
Can we ask what the theme of your next book is? Or is that top secret?
No, not it's another espionage book, actually. It's another military history book, but a spy book with a military history element. Again, it's non-fiction.
Thank you, Robert. It's been really fascinating to talk to you today.
Well, thank you both. It's very kind of you to ask such thoughtful questions.
Brilliant, Robert. Really nice to meet with you and talk with you.